Welcome to Constant Variables, a podcast where we take a non-technical look at building and growing digital products. I'm Tim Bornholdt. Let's get nerdy.
Welcome to another episode in our Oofda series, sponsored by the Jed Mahonis Group. Does your company's digital tools have errors that are interrupting your team's ability to get work done? Maybe a developer left you hanging mid-project, or you're updating your roadmap, or maybe it's just been a while since you've launched and you need to make sure your app is up to date. Before you decide to buy new software or extend your relationship with your current tech provider, let the experienced team at the Jed Mahonis Group get under the hood to review your tech's current state and propose solutions that'll help you prioritize where to focus development efforts so you can move forward with confidence. To learn more, get to know us at jmg.mn.
Hey, Sarah, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here.
I'm sure you probably don't get a whole lot of people that are like, I'm really excited to talk about Agile project management, but I honestly am legitimately excited to talk about this with you. So I'd love for you to take a second to give us a little bit of your background and what led you onto the path of being a project manager.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So really quick, like my elevator speech of my background. So my first career was in higher education. I was an administrator. So it had nothing really to do with tech, but that world is heavily, big staffs, a lot of projects, whether they called them that or not. So a lot of the core pieces to project management. And so when I realized that it was time to make a little bit of a pivot, I kind of ended up by chance being asked multiple times to come in and run projects. And so it sort of evolved from there. And that in the early days of my project management experience, I would not say I was necessarily seeking out tech, but I ended out on a contract with Allen Interactions, which is a group out of the Twin Cities that mostly does gamified e-learning. So some iterative development, and that sort of started the wheels turning and me kind of heading more in that direction. And then it just sort of grew a little bit organically. And I would say the team that when I worked with a education product called Mayan, that team was the kind of the place where I learned a lot of the technical stuff that I know. There were great people there who were very willing to sit with me and explain why they did different things and how they made decisions. And so that was really where I kind of cut my teeth. And then since then, I've kind of made the rounds between project roles that were on the consulting side of the fence. So I've been with a couple of consulting agencies, and then also I've kind of waded into the product space and have had a product manager role in a couple, like 2 years ago. So I have kind of both sides of it. And with all that, the common thread is there's some flavor of Agile. And I think that, anyone who works in the tech space knows that that's a pretty popular methodology to use. And so that's sort of how I've gotten to where I am. And I found that because of my background as an educator, I've been able to come in and really help not only bring teams on board, technical teams on board with Agile, but also really work with the business side and helping them understand what we're doing and why, which is a really key piece to it actually working from a methodology standpoint.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you can't do any of this stuff without a complete organizational buy-in. And it's even if you have a team of tech people that are interested in doing an approach like this, but you can't get the buy-in from higher up in the organization, then it's just kind of a cluster. So, I think before we get too far down the road, though, we ought to maybe get on the same page with some of these terms, that you hear around
Sure.
project management. And I think, Scrum, Agile, Waterfall, those are all things that I hear a lot about. So maybe we could start there with, what is the difference between a waterfall approach and a Scrum approach and an Agile approach?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, as I would explain it, kind of the traditional project management approach, especially when you look at like the PMI, the Project Management Institute, which is sort of the gold standard for project management, at least in the United States. I would guess if you pulled out their handbook from 20 or 30 years ago, waterfall was the methodology, which is really saying like we list out all of the different tasks that have to happen and set dates to them. If things have dependencies, we call that out, and it just sort of follows that path, that pattern, and that, at the end, you have whatever we were building. If it was software, we have a usable software package. If it was, you know, dog food, we have dog food, whatever it is. And that, I think the thing that with waterfall that's attractive is that when you're working with business stakeholders, especially leaders who, are busy and have, just want to know, like, tell me when it's going to be in my hands, or when is it going to be usable for the users. So that's, I think, one of the things that gets commonly attached to with waterfall is that it is believed to answer when. So thinking about in the agile space, there's kind of a number of different terms that will pop up. There's agile, which is really the name for the overarching philosophy, if that's for lack of a better term. And so when you go and you pull out the original manifesto and you kind of look at the history of agile, that group of, I think it was 17 tech folks that met and said, well, these are some things that we agree on, and that kind of got to that core, what they call the manifesto, that core piece. And then there's all of their principles. But within that is where you get into, things like Agile Fall, which is, when there's some flavor of Agile methodology being used mixed in with waterfall project management. There are what are some other ones that there's Scrum, which is kind of that, I think the history on Scrum isn't it a term used in rugby, and it's when the players all kind of go together in the middle of the field, and so it's become a term that's been borrowed, for lack of a better term, and is kind of that idea of we come together and we figure it out, and then we go back and we each do our individual piece and then come together again and figure it out. So it kind of gets into that iterative part. What are some other key terms that might be helpful? There's Kanban is a
Yeah, I was
methodology
just thinking about that.
within,
Yeah.
there's SAFe. I don't know if you've heard of that one. So that would be scaled agile, which is sometimes used in bigger organizations. So there's a lot of different flavors in it. And I think that's one of the things that, when I look at both the project side of managing a team that's using agile methodology, and then how do you work with, from a delivery standpoint, what goes out, there's that question of what's our goal, because the methodology really needs to match to what the goal is, because as I always say, like, technical people, like, just naturally gravitate to agile in some form. They like to iterate, they like to think, like, let's start and prototype this and then figure out what the next thing is, which is all kind of falls under the umbrella of agile. But how
Yeah.
they where I think it's been a challenge is how do technical folks explain the method to their madness out to people who go, I just want to know on the calendar when that's going to be done.
Oh yeah, that's definitely the hardest part of my job that I've seen is when I have to tell somebody, they give me an idea for an app, and there's so many unknowns as to how we will actually deliver the app idea, and it all comes together as an iterative format. But everyone at the end of the day is like, okay, well, how long is this going to take, and how much is this going to cost? And it's always interesting to me to see, like, how someone can use Agile to convince somebody of, like, just trust us, we'll get there eventually. Like, a lot of times people are like, I don't
Right.
want to hear that, I just want it done, and I want to know when it's going to be done.
Right. And I think that's where the project side of it kind of comes into play. And that, and it's definitely an evolving art form. In the last couple of years, the PMI has really, I think in their newest version, really, of their PMP certification, they've, I think, shifted more to include quite a bit more of the agile side of it. So I think there's starting to be more of a recognition in the project management world that at least anybody who does tech, and especially if they're doing development, because I can get into that distinction too between tech development and IT, which can be two very different worlds, even though they're all one umbrella. that there's some of that, like, well, how do we go in and say, this is how we got to our estimates, this is how we structured the plan. And I think one of the things that it has been, I've had it proven for myself multiple times in the past, is that when the technical team is able to spend the time, and it's sometimes not huge amounts of time, understanding what's being asked for, figuring out what their unknowns are, like the agile process really accounts for some of that, some of that in their planning. So, they're going from, hey, I have some business requirements, right? To, maybe there's a design that's been developed, the UX team has done some work, to saying, okay, here's what we think the technical solution should be. So when you have kind of those core pieces, you've got sort of the basis to a story. And then, the team then is coming in and going, okay, so that for one of the primary ceremonies is to do backlog grooming, which is so critical to, being able to say, hey, we've got, a defined grouping of work, that sprint, to go and work on. But, that's really the point where the team is coming together and saying, okay, so we're going to review these requirements and ask our questions and document the test case. Really dig into what's been asked for, so that, and in a lot of cases, spin it into multiple stories or multiple tickets, however they kind of are defining, the work, and then estimating it. And what happens then is being able to say, hey, we've broken down, that grouping of stories that went together in an epic to, create the login page. And we're estimating it's going to be X number of sprints to build that. And they're able to get, in a team that's pretty well developed, in my experience, has been pretty accurate in saying, we think it's going to take us 6 weeks, 3 sprints, 3 2-week sprints. And then that, helps then drive that conversation to say, okay, so the team, based on everything that they know and their estimates, is saying this many weeks to have this usable increment. And then from a project standpoint, I think that's where and this is where even some of the product understanding and knowledge comes into play, is being able to say, okay, so how are we getting this out to users? Is it as I like to kind of use the Facebook model, which is they probably deploy 100 times a day. They're just kind of constantly putting in new bug fixes, new features. Sometimes you'll hear they have a bigger, kind of more noticeable feature, and you'll hear somebody say, hey, I've got it, and you don't have it yet. So they obviously have a process of how long it takes to roll it out to everybody. But there's sort of that model of deployment and rollout, right, where you're not even notified, it just happens. And then there's sort of the other kind of end of the spectrum, which is we have a whole new build, a whole new version of our app, and we are going to tell people they have to update and adopt it, or it's a brand new product launch, and so that has a whole process. And so there's sort of the two sides of the fence, is like, just because we had an idea and a requirement, right? The technical team can figure out how to build just about anything, but then, like, what's the business side of it? And sometimes, at some point, those two things have to come together, because I think, one of the things that I was somewhat painfully reminded of this last year was, technical team can say with some degree of certainty, give or take 10%, how long it's going to take to build it, because if they're using Agile, they kind of know. But that doesn't answer the question of, like, how does the business team plan to get it out to users? And at the end of the day, I saw what actually was a pretty straightforward and kind of fast technical build go, like, to an 18-month project, because the last 9 months of it was rollout. How do we get it? How do we do the change management? How do we get it rolled out to users? And it was a relatively, I think it was a 5,000 person user base. So it was a decent sized group. And, the business leadership made some decisions about how they wanted to time that and break it up. And it went over 9 months, and I'm going, you could give it to everybody on the same day. It will be okay. Like, I'm a little more of a, like, just, push it out. People will be fine. But I think those are the things, when you look at the project side of it, is that that's some of where we still, I think, are trying to understand or figure out how to best handle that and how to best manage it, because there isn't the, Agile manifesto, and their kind of core beliefs really don't get at any of the um, that business side of it. But that's such a critical piece to the success of, a technical solution, if that
You
makes
know,
sense.
it really does, and it reminds me a lot. Like I'm sure you've seen the movie Office Space, but there's a lot of people who haven't seen that movie. There's a guy in there who is constantly like, I take the requirements and I talk to the technical people so that they don't have to like talk to them and like I always like growing up and seeing that I always felt bad for that guy and thought like, oh well, yeah, of course he's worthless and what ridiculous, like that's kind of how they paint it. But like the older I get, it's like you do need that like translation layer between the nerds actually writing the code and the non-nerds who have a business problem that needs to be solved with code. Because to your point, you've got the like technical people we can really figure things out and do whatever you need us to do, within the laws of physics or whatever, within reality. There's certain things you can't do, but for the most part, it's like you can tell us what the problem is and we can do it. But it's like, technical people, in my experience, have a really hard time actually understanding business needs and requirements, and conversely, business people just kind of see tech as this black box that's unapproachable, and it's really hard to understand. When somebody says it takes 6 weeks, well, by golly, it should take 6 weeks. What do you mean it's 7 weeks? And like it's the kind of bridging that gap is so hard. And so it sounds like these tools, like especially Agile, but just generally speaking, project managers, when you're dealing with tech people, they're really this translation layer of like, okay, I can speak to the tech people because I've experienced that. I either am technical or I've experienced enough tech people to understand how this works. And I also know how business people work and function, and how, you can understand how like a normal person, and I'm using air quotes there, how a normal person interacts with technology versus how a technical person interacts with technology. It's like you need to have that sort of layer of translation. And I think Agile seems to be like kind of it made me when you said I always say agile-ish, but you said agile fall, which made me laugh because I hadn't heard that term before. My question that I'm trying to reach towards is it seems like it's really hard to get a perfect process down. Like I've yet to actually, and this could just be me again, not being ignorant, but I feel like most companies are agile-ish or agile fall. Like there's some sort of balance that needs to be struck. And is that do you see that as well with your experience? Like, have you been on teams where it's like, nope, we are sticking to our ceremonies. This is agile through and through, and we have buy-in top to bottom. And what's your experience on that front, at least?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So my experience has primarily been that it's some flavor of Agile that fits the goals. It could be the goals of the
Yeah.
product. It could be the nature. So like, one of the first development teams that I worked with, they literally were extreme coders. Like they would have an idea at 8 o'clock in the morning, and by noon they had a prototype. And so they really didn't work well to requirements, which was a challenge. But we found that their best process was Kanban, so self-selecting. And then we kind of worked, collectively between the development manager and the QA manager, and the DevOps team that did the deployments, and really identified like what their process should be within kind of the Agile, um, kind of the Agile manifesto and the purpose. And so there were certain ceremonies for them that they didn't really do, like backlog grooming, because there wasn't, with the way that they worked. Like I'll never forget the day when we were multiple weeks really into building out some reporting features. And I was talking with the developer, and I was like, okay, I referenced this fairly detailed spreadsheet that had been included with the original kind of discussion. And he was like, oh, I never looked at that. And I nearly died because I was like, all the requirements were in there. And I'm thinking, how is QA going to know what to test? Like they don't even know what to write a test case for. Like they're just kind of flying blind, right? So we then had to really think about, okay, so from a process perspective, if we can't get them to follow like documented requirements, then we need to figure out like what makes sense in their process on the back end to make sure that QA gets what they need. So then we kind of built in a version of, because they weren't working in sprints because they were Kanban, but sort of a version of the sprint review so that we could start having the development team show their progress to the QA team so that QA could go and actually like go, okay, well then that they did this, 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 and this. So this is what we have to test, because they weren't going to be able to go, okay, these are the original requirements. Did they build that? Because they didn't work that way. So like that's, one example, and that's probably a little bit extreme, but I think that that may happen more often than we admit. I have actually experienced with one company, which was tech led, very, all of their software was sold. I think it was all licensed on a software as a service, kind of roughly on that kind of end of the spectrum. So because they were very tech focused first, the entire process from product all the way down really focused on and was really built off of Agile. So we did everything from OKRs, or objectives and key results planning, which I think there's a book on it. So we really went roadmap out, 2+ years from a product standpoint. And then usually we were working kind of on a plan, like planning a couple of quarters out, so that when we came into the quarter and we were talking with our technical team, like they were able to be pretty focused on what we were trying to deliver within, a little bit of variance. But that organization was pretty good about, like, we follow the ceremonies. We have, like, there were some adjustments like backlog grooming, I think, in the Agile kind of rules, they talk about like when you're reviewing a story in planning poker, you're supposed to time box it to like something really short, like 5 minutes. We would, there were a lot of times where we would get into a story and there would be questions and things that were missing. And so we would take the time to really fill it in, even though it went well over what the time box rules were. So like we did a lot of that type of adjusting, but we had every ceremony, and really one of them that I see a lot of teams kind of gloss over or not do super well is the retrospective. And that sprint review where you're kind of having the show and tell of what did we do in this time frame. And if you're running Kanban, you can still kind of have that review. You just have to build it in. And then that, on a regular cadence, coming in and doing that retrospective and saying what went well, what did we maybe not do so well, and what are we going to do about it? And I really have seen teams grow and pivot because they took the time, even if it was 30 minutes every 2 weeks, to have that conversation and then commit to whatever they were going to improve on. And that becomes a really kind of key piece for how well that development team works together. And then, what happens is their estimates get more precise. They, maybe they identify something that wasn't well defined in a ticket, and they're able to go back and say, how do we do a better job when we're, what were the unknowns that we maybe could do a better job of having the information on, if that makes sense. So it all, I guess I'm a big advocate, having seen it work really well, and understanding like what it meant for the bigger picture. Because then in my role as the product manager at that point, I was able to go in and say, yeah, I know somebody high up, CEO, chief product officer, whoever it was, really wants that feature in, a particular time space. Here's the reasons why we can or can't meet that. Because I was armed then with a lot of data from my team, both like high level, where we were sitting on the roadmap, but then also their velocity and their feedback, and just things that, we either had like a metric for, or, I knew just from a conversation with them to be able to say, yes, that can happen or not. And like in one case, there was a goal from a feature, really, it was a new product almost perspective, to launch something. And I was able to go, okay, well, here's all those things that have to happen first. And our, t-shirt size puts us out 18 months from where you want it to be. What do you want to do? because then your options are either like put more resources against it, because there's ways in the project planning side of it where you can have a fairly large, group of developers working on the same initiative and structure it in a way so that they're not colliding with each other or creating chaos with each other. I mean, there's kind of that too many cooks in a kitchen piece, but
Yeah.
like there are ways to do it. But you have to go, okay, well then are we willing to make that team bigger? We've got to scale it. Or if the answer is no, then it's like, well, here's what they're going to reasonably be able to do to, and this is when you're going to get it. Which one do you want? Or if you have an idea in between. So those are kind of, I mean, to answer your question, yes, it can go a lot of different ways, but my experience has predominantly been that the organization and their culture a lot of times drives what it will end up looking like. And that from as a person who's been in the consulting space, I think that's one of the things that's the most exciting is kind of getting that feel for how does this client use Agile, because everybody says they do it. And then what are their goals and how do we help kind of coach them and pivot them to improve? So like an example
Yeah.
was I had a client where they wanted things faster. They always wanted things faster. But we also knew that their cycle time on features was about 2 years, because between like their UX process being kind of separated from the development team, like they were using outside UX agency with a different development group that didn't really have contact with them, that was then creating quite a bit of time. Because what would happen is, as my front end lead said one day, he's like, yeah, we would like they'd throw over the fence this huge stack of wireframes for us to review, and he's like, when it's hundreds of pages, it takes months to
Yeah.
break it down, ask questions, understand what they meant. Of course, at that point the client has latched on to whatever feature got proposed by UX that may or may not, in a lot of cases is going to increase the technical scope. So then you're going, okay, well, do you understand that, moving the logout button into the header is going to require an extra 3 sprints worth of work because now we have to change code that we weren't planning on touching. Like there's all those different conversations that have to happen. And so what we were able to do is, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but Ann Steiner, who used to be DevJam, out of the Twin
Yeah.
Cities, now owned by C Prime. Fabulous person to know. Really a brilliant mind in kind of how do you explain like what's feasible in a time frame. And so because we knew that this client wanted faster, we engineered really and then presented to them a process that ran. When our internal UX team could do the design work, they were able to vet technically everything that they were thinking about even talking to the client about, so that the client didn't see anything in a design, a wireframe or an actual, high fidelity design, until we had confirmed with the technical team what it would take to build it. So then
Mhm.
we were able to go from 2 years to 6 months on a feature build because we had a lot more certainty in what they were seeing and approving before they even saw it and approved it, so that when they said, yep, we want that, we could almost immediately go into development because we had done a lot of that front end planning. So I think that's one of the things that sometimes people forget is that Agile doesn't mean don't plan. It just kind of puts a structure around how and when you plan. Um,
Well,
if
I
that
think
kind of
that
makes sense.
it definitely makes sense. One thing that leads me to then is I think from my standpoint, like just to recap this at a high level, waterfall is upfront. You come up with the entire plan, and then you just start at step A, and you get to step Z, and you follow the process, and it's done. And then agile is more the process behind it is you work in small iterative chunks, and you may plan out like a little ways ahead, especially at the beginning. You can only plan so far ahead because you don't know how the process works. But as you get more comfortable with it, you can start to be better at estimating, this certain feature is going to take this many sprints, and you work in smaller, more iterative chunks where the the work that you had done in the previous sprints informs what's going to go on in the next sprints. One question I have for you though is I hear there's the product management and project management where they sound so similar that you almost think that they're the same thing, but I'm certain that you'll inform us that they're not. How does product management and project management differ? Like how would you explain that to somebody?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, the first piece to it is it does really depend upon the organization because I've been in organizations. So from a skills perspective, the two roles use a lot of the same skills. Like there's a pretty heavy project, just understanding how to go from point A to point B piece in product. And there's a heavy piece. So, like, the difference between the two roles, in my experience, really is that product gets more into the strategy end of the spectrum. So, they are, a lot of times tasked with figure out the pricing, tell sales, everything they need to know about this product and the features so that they can go sell it, inform marketing on how to market it appropriately. So, a lot of the, business facing data and pieces of information that are really important for the product to sell. Because if it doesn't sell and make money, there's like no point in the investment to build it.
Right.
Which in some, you know what I mean? Like those two things have to go hand in hand. So I think that's where product comes into play is that in their role, in a lot of cases, they're doing, a huge range of strategy driven conversations and decisions. They're interacting with customers to say, what's working for you, what's not. Like there's a lot of those kind of parts of the picture, because really your customer, the voice of the customer is probably one of the most key things about the success of the product. Like if you don't understand how people are going to use it and what they're saying about it and what, what pain points they're trying to solve using your product, then you're not, you're really, your idea might be great, but you're missing the mark, because it's people have to want to buy it. Um, the other part to it is kind of thinking about, I think the other piece with product is, they're really there as like a best advisor to the technical team. So in a lot of cases, the product manager is not down in the weeds and managing. Um, they're just involved. So that I think that's a really kind of critical piece is knowing that their role usually isn't as close to the actual work. They're kind of going more, like I said, the strategy. So project typically is that person that um, is owning the deliverable. In kind of those more waterfall or agile fall setups, they're saying, okay, so the technical team is using agile as a process, and here's when here's when the next review is going to be, and this is what it means, and then that we're projecting out this date. They're managing budgets. They're managing, for lack of kind of a better term, the staffing or resourcing behind the project. So they're kind of more in that space. And so I think that's the piece that's really kind of when you delineate the two, and then not to muddy the waters, but that in between is actually the product owner, who tends to be in some organizations, you'll see product manager, product owner, and project managers who have distinctly separate roles. And then in some places, you'll see kind of a flavor of some mix of both, or maybe only one. It just depends. But that product owner role is in a lot of places kind of does more of a hybrid of some strategy pieces, so product manager, and then some more tactical project pieces, where they're maybe managing more of the day to day. So you'll kind of see all three. And I think that's an important kind of distinction to make is that that role actually in the Agile Manifesto is called out pretty heavily, that you usually have a Scrum Master who's more project manager-ish. And then you'll have, and they're kind of the task person. And then you'll have the product owner who's going, okay, so I've talked with the product manager, or I am the product manager too. And this is why we need to build what we need to build. And those two usually work really closely together to make sure that if there's a business analyst, that they're documenting the correct requirements to take to the team to say, okay, this is what we're going to do next. And then to bring it all full circle, that sprint review, when the team is presenting what they've completed, those reviews become really critical actually in kind of keeping that iterative loop going. Because I mean, I've had clients go, "Oh, we really like that," or, "Ooh, that wasn't exactly what we were expecting," because sometimes things don't quite, they see it in the UX reviews and the wireframes and the, high fidelity designs, but how it actually works in real life once it's built can be a little bit different, right? So sometimes that feedback was really helpful because then we were able to pivot, address the feedback, and come back, a sprint later in some cases and say, okay, we fixed that. And in the in a waterfall build, that comes at the end. So you have no idea, and you maybe had developers working for another 6 months on something, not knowing that that's what the feedback was gonna be. And then you have to go back after and change all of it, or make that change, which sometimes can have a huge impact. So that's where you sometimes see that precision lost in the methodology. So I think that's one of the big selling points behind Agile is saying, if we're following the ceremonies and using at least the intent of why they're there, whether you call them what Agile, the Agile Manifesto calls them, or you do something else, that close interaction really creates a more certainty in the timing. So then when the customer is saying, I want my app built in 6 months, and you're looking at them like, how is this possible? That might be your best shot, along with saying, okay, what do you absolutely need to have for a user to have a usable product first, and then we can add to it, sometimes in pretty quick succession.
This has been so helpful for me, like from the technical side. I've worked I started an agency right out of college, and I've been doing development my whole life. And so it's like having an understanding of like, the role that I've played in like at JMG has been like being both a product owner, a project manager, a product owner, and product manager, and being the developer all in one person, which is fine when you're on a small scale kind of project and you can keep all of that in your head. But the bigger that the project gets and the more people that are in the equation, having those distinct roles, being able to really help everyone succeed in what they're doing best, in order to be able to take business requirements, translate them into both how long is it going to take and in what order do they need to be done in, and then taking that to somebody who can just be sitting there cranking out code 40 hours a week or however, whatever it is. Seeing that pipeline makes the whole process a lot more clear to me. So I really appreciate you breaking this down for me. That the one last question that I have for you around all of this process and stuff is, and I know usually when we bring on experts, it's like they can't help but this is it's you can't leave it just at work. Like you're interested in this topic, and so what I'm curious is, do you know, like, are there resources you turn to learn, like, whether it's influencers or podcasts or whatever around project management and product management? Are there different resources that you tend to gravitate towards that might be good for sending the audience here towards?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I did mention her a little bit earlier, but Ann Steiner and the C Prime team are fabulous. And I want to say that if you, I think have brought it all over, but Dev Jam was their original kind of training group, for lack of a better term. And they have some really great, I think they're all out on YouTube, just recordings of some of their sessions and different speeches that Anne or other folks from their team have made. And those are highly interesting and really, really helpful in the sense of, because I think one of the things that I really struggled with is you get sent by your company out to do the Agile class, to get the certified Scrum Master. And it doesn't really teach you anything other than kind of the core concepts. Like it's too, because it's a framework. And so then you're like, okay, now what? Right. So being able to really like hear somebody give some like thought leadership on how to actually like make it usable was really impactful for me. And like if you do one of her courses, like I know when it was brought in, one of my previous employers brought her in, and it was like a full 2-day workshop. But we walked out and we're like, oh my gosh, like we can do this. We can go back and say, hey, this is how we do it. Like 'cause some of the things we were struggling with, she at least gave some insight into how to address. So, and that's where and that's really informed my thinking to say like, okay, well, in order to get to an MVP, you've got to go like, how do I go from point A to point B? And how does a user go from point A to point B? Like, what things do they need? And so we started actually planning in that mindset. Like, okay, if we need to build a login page, what are the absolute like bare requirements to get to logging into something? Because most applications have a login. Like that's a pretty common thing, right? So we would break everything down kind of in that lens. And then we were able to t-shirt size and estimate and then kind of have that conversation about like, here's what you absolutely would need out the gate for it to be usable. Here's what we would say should be the next phase. Here's the, like we were really able to plan it out in a way that became more predictable, which then kind of gets back at that original, waterfall thinking to say, hey, I want to know when I'm going to have X, because then the business can go, well, we want users to have phase 1 and phase 2, the MVP phase and the second phase before they get it. And then that can drive all the conversations about delivery. And, you kind of get into that product side. So that's one of them. I really like a lot of times I'll just Google if I have a question, which sounds really crazy, but things like Agile Alliance, a lot of times will pop up because that's kind of, I think, the core group of people who founded Agile. I'm pretty sure that's their site. And so it just has some really good basics. Those are probably the ones that I go to the most. I mean, I like kind of dabble in some of the PMI, like, do I want one of their certifications? Do I not? So I'll sometimes go and look at, well, what are they saying? Because it's, it's always helpful to kind of have that rounded perspective. And then, if you're local in the Twin Cities, like the meetup, well, I think they still meet virtually. There's a couple of really agile focused and product focused groups that have been pretty active. So, I mean, you probably know this being in the area, but like our tech community has been relatively small, but it has some really great people in it. But they have been pretty connected. And so that's another place for, and I think that's true in any city, like go look at what's out there, because there are, organizations that are either product focused, technical product focused or agile focused that, those groups sometimes just meet, sometimes they meet virtually, and sometimes it's just helpful to listen to what people are talking about and get their perspective. So those would be kind of the places I would go, or, and look, I do Google a ton of stuff and just whatever comes up that answers the question is what I look at.
That sounds exactly like how I do my job. Like the other day, Stack Overflow went down, and I was trying to program just something for fun at night, and it went down, and I'm like, oh, I don't know how to do my job now, so I guess I'm just gonna put my laptop down for the night.
Right? No, I know we become so dependent on like. I mean,
on sharing,
or like when Amazon has had, right? Yeah, like when there's been an outage, when the cloud's down, it's like everybody just looks at each other like, what do we do now?
Oh, Sarah, this has been great. Where can people connect with you online?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, LinkedIn is probably the easiest because that's kind of where I keep my professional network. And so that's where I love to hear from folks. And I'm more than willing to try to meet. I've met with a lot of people in the past, just like, hey, I'll lend you some of my thoughts. And so, send me a message. Sometimes a little bit slow at responding, but, I'm more than willing to hop on a quick call with somebody to give some insight.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah. I've learned a lot about project management and product ownership and the whole gamut. So I really appreciate you taking the time to explain it here today.
No, it was my pleasure. And thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I mean, I love talking about the work that I do. And so this was super fun and exciting to be able to share some of my perspective.
Thanks to Sarah Peete for joining Tim on the podcast today. You can get to know Sarah by connecting with her on LinkedIn. Show notes for this episode can be found at constantvariables.co. You can get in touch with the show by emailing hello@constantvariables.co, or you can find us on Twitter at @CV_podcast. Today's episode was produced by Jenny Karkowski and edited by the killer Jordan Doust. And I mean killer as in awesome Jordan, not like cereal. If you enjoyed Tim's conversation with Sarah about agile methodologies, please take a second to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. If you help us out with a rating and review, we'll thank you with a shout out on the show. Open the Apple Podcast app on your iOS device or visit constantvariables.co/review and we'll take you right there. This episode was brought to you by the Jed Mahonis Group. Check us out at jmg.mn.